rule the waves. Britons never, never, never shall be slaves.
Now that's a remarkable piece of music.
So,
Do you know the music?
Rule Britannia.
Rule Britannia.
I kind of rule Britannia, but yes, Rule Britannia.
Not the national anthem of Britain, but in many ways the unofficial national anthem of Great Britain. If you ever watch the BBC Pops series, you know, when they did the A Night at the Proms thing, they always play Rule Britannia. It's this cultural thing today in Britain. Written in the 1740s, and it's expressly about that moment in British history when Britons were being captured along the Barbary coast in the Mediterranean.
In the Mediterranean, yeah.
Being sold into slavery into Algeria and places along the North African coast, and being then rescued and often ransomed and brought back to Britain. But celebrating the rescue of Britons, and that's saying Britons never, ever, ever shall be slaves.
Now,
the irony, this is the height of Britain's participation in the Atlantic slave trade.
That's an
So
irony.
it's a song about freedom. It's a song about Britons as a national people, a free people, celebrating the fact that they're not slaves as they engage in mass slavery.
So it's a deep irony.
Deep irony.
Now, this is a lesson, one of our last, on work and freedom.
Yes.
So how's that related then? Of course, through the theme of slavery and abolition. And what else?
Because again, ironically, it reflects the fact that equality and beliefs in equality have permeated British political thinking by this time.
Yeah.
And certainly by the early 19th century, these are broadly liberal societies. And that's why abolition emerges in this time period. It becomes a political possibility in Britain in the early 19th century. But it's still kind of predicated on that old notion, and that makes it really quite interesting from our perspective. So work, equality, all those basic ideas are now fundamental parts of political discourse. And yet slavery still exists. It's just been abolished in the British Empire, still exists in America, still exists in Brazil, still exists in large parts of the world.
So we're looking at the very end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century.
But today we're going to look at that moment of transition. We're going to look at that moment out of slavery. So we're going to look at two societies in that moment of transition. We're going to look at two secondary readings. That's all we're going to be doing this week. We're at the end of the course. Winding down a bit, want you to be working on those assignments.
Right, the final assignments and the final exam preparation.
Final exam is coming, and the readings this week are part of that exam. Take note of that for sure. But two essays. I only want you to read one this week, but one by John Larson on the United States in the period between roughly 1835 and 1855, looking at a series of significant economic changes for farmers, for workers, for slaves, for industry, looking at a whole series of changes in American society, all related to a basic transition from an agricultural economy, a colonial economy, into a more settled industrial economy, and the changes the impacts of those changes in American society. And then a second essay
James
by
Epstein.
James Epstein, a British historian, who looks at the debate on Trinidad in that moment of the abolition of slavery. And this is something that we hardly ever think about when we talk about these big questions, but Trinidad was a slave economy.
Right.
Thousands and thousands of workers were slave workers. It's a valuable economy. They're producing sugar for the Atlantic world.
Part of like Haiti.
Absolutely, very much like Haiti, exactly. Part of that broader Caribbean plantation economy of staples of cottons and indigo and tobacco and sugar. Sugar is the biggest by far. And now they have to actually figure out, how do we continue to run that economy when we don't have slaves? And so British policymakers are looking at that question. How can we govern that place under free labor conditions? How can we still make it work? How can we still make it part of our economy?
The work and freedom are
critical,
and they're intertwined in fundamentally changing ways. So what we're looking at as a big question for this week is the way that new liberal thinking, that is one of the benchmarks or the characteristics of what we sometimes call the European Enlightenment, is changing the Atlantic world economy, the way people's lives are organized, the way political life is shaped, and all its various possibilities in the Americas, from the Caribbean into the United States, the early United States. And that's a pretty big question again. Now, we've been dealing almost only with
Every week.
really big questions,
Yep.
but this is like the lesson on abolition, this is a chance for everyone to try to pull strands,
Yes.
threads from the beginning of the course up until now together. And the readings from Larson and Epstein are ways of doing that. But we can also think maybe back to the first module even, changes in European agricultural economies. We looked at the British agricultural economy. What we're looking at this week, if I could summarize things that you've just said, Danny, is a transition from an agricultural economy to a new industrial economy in which people's lives, working lives, are profoundly changed on a mass level.
Yes.
Individuals matter a great deal, but there's many, many hundreds of thousands of individuals' lives who are shaped here.
Absolutely.
And so we want to try to make sense of those big changes and understanding that there's a ethical dimension here as well at play. There are profound changes, important dimensions of historical thinking that we can then work on trying to also make sense of towards the end of the course after thinking about historical analysis skills for so long.
That ethical dimension is really, really important. I think in the past, if we were doing this course 30, 40, 50 years ago, we would have viewed the transition that we're looking at today as part of progress, as part of a good process that was underway.
Which is a kind of ethical way of thinking.
Absolutely, absolutely it is. Except historians today tend to think of this more problematically. They say that the people are, in going from being farmers to workers, are actually losing freedom, not actually gaining freedom.
So,
that slaves may get political freedom, but they have no economic capacity to look after themselves. So they're in fact actually less free because they're thrown onto a market where they're meant to spend for themselves all of a sudden.
Yeah.
So there's a much more complex story than it might have been told in the past.
So the relationship between liberalism and change in the Atlantic world is really a big question because there's no obvious answer here then.
Yeah.
So work and freedom, question mark. Maybe.
Yes, well put. So this week, linked to the exam, the readings, we have two readings. We're only asking you to do one reading this week for the discussion in the forum. But for the exam, you'll read both of these essays. You'll be commenting on them.
Right.
So look at your fellow group mates and what they're talking about. Look for ideas. Look for ideas to make those big connections. Begin thinking about your exam now. Don't start writing it yet, but moment to start thinking about pulling some of those strands together.
Yeah. Good. Well, this is a task which would have been too big at the beginning of the course, but we expect it should be manageable now.
Absolutely, yeah.
So
Epstein and Larson give you some pretty clear parameters to work with, some pretty clear pieces of evidence to work with, a big picture look, some significant themes, and links nicely, I think, into our broader themes.
Okay. I'm curious to know what everyone comes up with as analysis and connections.